Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. We are so happy to have you with us today. This is a place where we learn English together and also talk about important global topics. By listening carefully, you can improve your vocabulary, practice listening skills, and also understand more about the world. Today, we bring you a very big and serious subject that connects politics, trade, and geography all in one story.
Yes, today we will talk about a very important topic. Australia stuck between the United States and China. How long can it survive? This is not just a headline. It is a real challenge for one of the world's most developed countries. Australia is in the middle of two powerful nations. On one side, it has strong military and cultural ties with the United States. On the other side, its economy depends deeply on China. This makes Australia's position very unique and very difficult.
Before we go deeper, dear listeners, we invite you to support the English Globe. Please take a second to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell so you do not miss our future episodes. Your support helps us create more educational content for English learners around the world. Also, we would love to know where you are listening from. Please write in the comments which country you are from and share your thoughts about today's topic.
This is also a great way to practice your English. Writing even one or two sentences in the comments helps you use new words, express your ideas, and connect with other learners across the world. And we promise we read your opinions. Sometimes your ideas also help us design better topics for the future. So do not be shy. Tell us what you think about Australia's situation, and tell us what part of the world you are listening from.
Now, let us slowly begin our journey into today's subject. Australia is a country in the Southern Hemisphere. It is the only nation that is also a continent. This geography makes it very special. On one hand, it is close to Asia. On the other hand, it has a long history of ties with Western countries like Britain and the United States. Because of this, Australia sits in the middle of two worlds, which often pull it in different directions.
Geographically, Australia is surrounded by the Pacific and Indian Oceans. This position is not only beautiful, but also strategic. Many of the world's most important shipping lanes pass near Australia. Goods move through these waters every day, linking Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Control of this region matters for trade and security. This is why Australia is not just a small island far away. It is a key player in the Asia-Pacific region, and both the US and China know how important it is.
When we talk about importance, we also need to look at alliances. Australia is part of the ANZ-US Treaty, which is a security agreement between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. This means that Australia has promised to stand with the US in case of a major threat. It has military cooperation, intelligence sharing, and regular joint exercises with the United States. This makes the US one of Australia's strongest and oldest partners in security.
At the same time, we cannot ignore economics. Over the past 2 decades, China has become Australia's largest trading partner. Australia sells iron ore, coal, gas, and agricultural products to China. In return, it imports manufactured goods. Thousands of Chinese students go to study in Australian universities. Millions of Chinese tourists visit the country every year. This trade relationship has made Australia richer, but it has also made it dependent on China's economy.
So here we see the dilemma. On one hand, Australia trusts the United States to protect its security. On the other hand, Australia needs China to keep its economy strong. But the United States and China are not friends. They are rivals. They compete in technology, trade, and even military power. They both want to be the most influential power in the Asia-Pacific. And Australia, with its special location and resources, is right in the middle of this struggle.
This is why our topic today is not only about politics, but also about survival. Australia must make very smart choices. If it leans too much towards the US, it risks losing trade with China. If it leans too much towards China, it risks losing the trust of the US and its allies. So the question is, How long can Australia continue to balance between these two giants without breaking apart? That is the big question we will explore step by step in this podcast.
And as we move forward, dear listeners, remember that this is also an English learning opportunity. You will hear new words like alliance, dependence, rivalry, and dilemma. Listen carefully, repeat them, and try to use them in your own sentences. The best way to learn English is not only to listen, but also to practice. That is why we encourage you to share your ideas in the comments and join this global learning community.
So, with that clear introduction, we are ready to dive deeper into the details of Australia's position. In the next parts of this podcast, Adam and I will explain history, economy, security, and possible futures. But for now, just keep in mind one simple fact. Australia is not just a distant island. It is a frontline state in the rivalry between the United States and China. And the choices it makes will shape the future of the Asia-Pacific region.
To understand Australia's present situation, we first need to look at its past. History shows us why Australia feels so close to the United States today. After World War II, the world was divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Australia, like many other Western countries, decided to align with the United States. This choice was not random. It came from a real fear of being isolated and unsafe in a changing world.
Yes, the Second World War was a turning point. Before that, Australia relied heavily on Britain for protection. But during the war, Britain was too far away to defend Australia. When Japanese forces advanced across the Pacific, Australia felt truly threatened. It was the United States that came to help. American soldiers fought alongside Australian forces in battles across the Pacific. That cooperation built trust. For the first time, Australians saw the United States not just as a faraway country, but as a real protector.
This trust quickly developed into a formal agreement. In 1951, Australia signed the AUKUS Treaty with the United States and New Zealand. The treaty stated that if any of these countries were attacked in the Pacific, the others would come to help. Even though the treaty language was sometimes vague, it showed commitment. It was a promise that Australia would never stand alone again. For Australians, this treaty became the backbone of their security policy for decades.
And this is important for our listeners to understand. When we say alliance, we mean a formal agreement between countries to cooperate, especially in defence. Alliances give small countries like Australia more confidence because they know a larger partner will support them. With the AUKUS Treaty, Australia connected itself permanently to the United States. From then on, America was not just a friend. It was a security partner, tied by a promise.
Over the years, this partnership grew stronger. Australia supported the United States in many international conflicts. For example, Australian troops fought alongside Americans in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Even if some Australians disagreed with these wars, their government often joined because of the alliance. This shows the level of loyalty Australia has had towards the United States. It is not only words, it is actions and sacrifices on the battlefield.
But the alliance was not only about war. It also included intelligence sharing. Australia became part of what is called the Five Eyes intelligence network, together with the US, UK, Canada, and New Zealand. This means Australia shares secret information with these countries and receives important intelligence from them. For security, this is extremely valuable. It allows Australia to know about threats earlier and prepare better. Again, this deepened the feeling of trust with the United States.
Another reason why Australia feels so close to the United States is cultural. Both countries are English-speaking. They share similar democratic values, a free press, and open political debate. Movies, music, and sports from America are very popular in Australia. Many Australians study in the United States or travel there. This cultural closeness makes the alliance feel natural. It is easier to trust a country when you feel you share the same values and lifestyle.
That is true. And language plays a big role. Because Australia and the United States both use English, it is easier for their military forces to train together, for their governments to communicate, and for their citizens to connect. For our English learners listening, notice how language can be more than just words. It can also be a bridge between countries. It can build trust and make cooperation smoother. This is one reason English is often called a global language.
So by the end of the 20th century, Australia was fully inside the American security circle. The US had military bases and training operations in Australia. They carried out joint exercises regularly. In return, the US promised to defend Australia if it was ever attacked. For many Australians, this was comforting. Their country is geographically isolated, and its population is small compared to its large land area. Having the US as a protector felt like insurance against threats.
Still, we should remember that alliances also bring responsibilities. Because Australia is close to the US, it often feels pressure to follow American decisions. Sometimes this creates debate inside Australia. Some people feel the alliance makes them too dependent. Others argue it keeps the country safe. But overall, history shows us that Australia has rarely said no to America. The friendship has been steady and strong, even when politics became complicated.
To sum up this part, we can say that Australia's ties with the United States are built on three pillars: history, security, and culture. History goes back to World War II, when America defended Australia. Security is shown by treaties like AUKUS and military cooperation, and culture connects them through language, democracy, and shared values. Together, these three pillars explain why Australia feels so strongly linked to the United States.
Exactly. And this background is essential before we talk about today's problems. Without knowing this history, it is difficult to understand why Australia always leans toward America in times of crisis. It is not just a matter of choice. It is a relationship built over 70 years of trust, war, peace, and cooperation. In the next part of our podcast, we will see how China entered the story and changed the balance. But for now, we hope our listeners understand the deep roots of this US-Australia connection.
Now that we have looked at the historical and security ties with the United States, let us turn to the other side of the story: economics. In the modern world, money and trade shape decisions just as much as weapons and treaties. For Australia, China has become the most important economic partner. If we look at trade numbers, nearly 1/3 of Australia's exports go to China. That is a very large portion. It means that for every $3 Australia earns from selling goods overseas, $1 comes directly from China.
And these goods are not small or unimportant. The biggest export is iron ore. Australia is the world's largest exporter of iron ore, and China is the world's biggest buyer. This material is used to make steel, which China needs for its buildings, bridges, and factories. Without Australian iron ore, China's construction industry would face big problems. On the other side, without selling iron ore to China, Australia would lose billions of dollars in income. This shows us how the two countries depend on each other.
Coal is another big item. Australia exports both thermal coal, which is used for power plants, and metallurgical coal, which is used for making steel. China has bought huge amounts of this in the past. For example, before political tensions increased, China was Australia's #1 coal customer. These exports are worth many billions each year. If China stops buying coal from Australia, thousands of Australian workers and mining communities could face unemployment and economic stress.
And let us not forget agriculture. China imports Australian beef, wine, barley, and dairy products. These items are not only about money, they are also about jobs in rural Australia. Farmers in Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria rely on Chinese customers. When trade relations are good, they celebrate. When China imposes tariffs or restrictions, farmers immediately feel the pain. A few years ago, when China placed tariffs on Australian wine, many small producers struggled to survive.
Education is also a major sector. For years, Chinese students have made up the largest group of international students in Australian universities. They pay higher fees than local students, and their money supports not only the universities, but also local economies such as housing, restaurants, and travel. In simple numbers, international education is worth more than $30 billion to Australia each year, and Chinese students are a large part of that figure. Without them, many universities would lose a big part of their income.
Tourism is another example. Before the pandemic, millions of Chinese tourists visited Australia each year. They spent money in hotels, shops, and tourist sites, like the Great Barrier Reef and Sydney Opera House. This tourism created jobs for guides, drivers, and workers in hospitality. When relations between the two countries become tense, Chinese tourism falls, and the impact is immediately visible. Cities like Melbourne and Sydney especially notice the difference.
So, if we combine all these sectors, iron ore, coal, agriculture, education, and tourism, we can see why China is so important to Australia. In fact, no other country buys as many Australian exports as China. The United States is a strong partner in security, but when it comes to money, it is China that dominates. This creates a very difficult situation. Australia feels safe with the United States, but it becomes rich through trade with China.
And here is the dilemma, dear listeners. On one side, Australia depends on China for its economy. On the other side, it depends on the United States for its security. What happens when these two powers become rivals? This is where Australia feels stuck. If it makes decisions that support the US, China might respond with economic punishment. If it tries to please China too much, it might weaken its alliance with the US. This is like walking on a thin rope between two tall buildings.
That is a good image. We can also call it balancing. Australia is always balancing between the two powers. But balancing is not easy. For example, in 2020, Australia called for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19. China was very unhappy with that decision. As a result, China placed tariffs on Australian barley and wine, and it also restricted imports of coal and beef. The message was clear. When Australia acts in a way China does not like, its economy will feel the cost.
But the relationship is not one-sided. China also needs Australia. Without Australian iron ore, its factories would slow down. Even when political tensions were high, China continued to import iron ore from Australia. This shows that dependence works in both directions. Still, the power balance is uneven because China's economy is much bigger. China has 1.4 billion people, while Australia has only 26 million. That size difference gives China more influence.
For English learners, notice how we use the words dependence and dilemma. Dependence means needing someone else for support or survival. A dilemma means a difficult choice between two options, where both have risks. Australia depends on China for trade, and it faces a dilemma because it also depends on the United States for security. These two words explain the heart of Australia's challenge.
Yes, and we should also see the human side. For Australian families, the debate is not only about politics, it is about jobs, education, and daily life. A farmer growing barley in Western Australia, a miner working in Queensland, a professor teaching Chinese students in Sydney. All of them are connected to China's market. If relations go bad, these people are the first to suffer. That is why many Australians worry about the costs of choosing sides in this rivalry.
At the same time, some Australians believe the country should reduce its dependence on China by finding new partners. They talk about trading more with India, Japan, South Korea, or countries in Europe. This is called diversification. It means not putting all your eggs in one basket. If Australia sells to many countries, it will not suffer so much when one partner becomes difficult. Diversification is one way Australia tries to solve its economic dilemma.
So, to close this section, we can say that China is both an opportunity and a risk for Australia. The opportunity is the money, the jobs, and the growth that come from trade. The risk is the political pressure and the dependence that come with it. Australia cannot simply walk away from China because the economic cost would be too high. But it also cannot ignore the security umbrella of the United States. This is the tightrope Australia must walk, and in the next section, we will see how this balancing act plays out in strategy.
After looking at Australia's security alliance with the United States and its economic dependence on China, we now arrive at the heart of the issue, the strategic dilemma. This dilemma is the problem of trying to balance two competing powers at the same time. For Australia, the United States provides safety, while China provides wealth. But when those two powers argue or clash, Australia must choose carefully. Each step carries risks.
That is why many experts say Australia is walking a tightrope. Imagine a person walking on a thin rope high above the ground. If they lean too much to one side, they fall. If they lean too much to the other side, they also fall. They must stay in balance, step by step. This is how Australia moves between the US and China. It tries not to anger either side too much, but this is not always possible. Politics, trade, and military interests often collide.
A good example is in technology. The United States asked Australia not to use Chinese company Huawei in its 5G network. The US said there were security risks. Australia followed America's request and banned Huawei. But this decision made China angry because Huawei is one of its biggest companies. Australia's choice showed loyalty to the US, but it also hurt relations with China. This is the kind of difficult choice Australia faces again and again.
Another area is the South China Sea. The United States often conducts freedom of navigation operations there to show that international waters should remain open. Australia supports this idea because it depends on free trade routes. But China claims large parts of the South China Sea as its own. So when Australia joins exercises or speaks against China's claims, Beijing sees it as unfriendly. Yet, if Australia stays silent, it may look weak to its allies.
These choices are not only about governments, they also affect businesses and citizens. For example, when Australia banned Huawei, it limited competition in the market. Some companies had to spend more money to find alternatives. Consumers may also have paid higher prices. So, strategic choices that seem political can also influence the daily lives of ordinary Australians. This shows how deep the balancing act goes.
And let us not forget diplomacy. Australian leaders often speak about wanting constructive relations with China, while also promising unbreakable ties with the United States. This double language shows the balancing act. In one speech, the Prime Minister might praise America's role in the Pacific. In another speech, he might highlight trade cooperation with China. But the truth is, both sides watch carefully, and neither likes to be ignored.
For English learners, notice the word dilemma. We used it in the last section, and here it becomes central again. A dilemma is when you have two options, but both carry risks. Choosing the US may anger China. Choosing China may anger the US. Staying in the middle may anger both. That is why the word dilemma perfectly describes Australia's situation. It is not an easy choice, and sometimes there is no perfect answer.
Some analysts argue that Australia should accept that the United States is its long-term partner and simply take the side of Washington in all disputes. They say the alliance has protected Australia for decades, and that loyalty is more important than money. These analysts believe that Australia should prepare for a future where the US and China compete even more, and the safest choice is to fully commit to the American side.
Others disagree. They say that China is Australia's largest trading partner and will remain so for many years. Cutting ties with China would hurt the economy, reduce jobs, and lower the standard of living. According to this view, Australia should avoid joining US-led moves that target China directly. Instead, it should focus on neutral language, quiet diplomacy, and keeping trade strong. These voices argue that survival depends on economic health.
Then there are voices in the middle. They argue that Australia must balance carefully, keeping close to the US in security while trying to remain friendly with China in trade. This is the current approach of the Australian government. It invests in military cooperation with the US and other allies, but it also sends diplomats to Beijing to repair trade relations. The strategy is not simple, but it reflects the reality that Australia cannot afford to lose either partner.
But balancing brings its own risks. If the US and China continue to grow further apart, it will become harder for Australia to stay in the middle. Imagine a rope being pulled strongly from both sides. At some point, it may snap. The tighter the rivalry becomes, the more pressure falls on Australia. This is why many observers wonder, how long can Australia survive without making a clear choice?
And this is where the concept of strategic autonomy comes in. Some Australians believe their country should reduce dependence on both powers and stand more independently. They say Australia should strengthen ties with other countries like India, Japan, South Korea, and nations in Southeast Asia. By building more partnerships, Australia could reduce pressure from both the US and China. But building autonomy takes time, money, and strong leadership.
Another term worth learning here is hedging. In international relations, hedging means preparing for multiple outcomes at the same time. Australia hedges by staying close to the US for security, while still trading heavily with China. It is like investing money in two different banks to reduce risk. But hedging can only work as long as the banks do not collapse or force you to choose. For Australia, the danger is that US-China tensions may grow too strong for hedging to work.
So the strategic dilemma is real and ongoing. Every new policy decision must consider both Washington and Beijing. Every military exercise, every trade deal, every diplomatic statement carries weight. Australia's leaders often say they want stability in the region, but stability is hard to keep when the two largest powers are moving further apart. For ordinary citizens, the dilemma may feel far away, but it quietly shapes their jobs, security, and future.
To close this section, let us remember the image of the tightrope. Australia is still walking on it, step by step. The United States is pulling on one side, China is pulling on the other, and below lies the risk of falling into economic or security trouble. So far, Australia has managed to keep its balance. But the question remains, how long can it continue before a stronger wind or a sudden shake forces it to choose?
That is exactly the question we will continue to explore in the next sections of our podcast. But for now, dear listeners, keep in mind the key words we have discussed: dilemma, balancing, autonomy, and hedging. These words not only help us understand Australia's situation, but also help you build a stronger vocabulary in English. Try using them in your own sentences and think about whether your own country also faces dilemmas in its international relations.
Dear listeners, let us now move to a very important part of our discussion. We will talk about security concerns in the Pacific. Many of you may already know that the Pacific is not only about blue water, sandy beaches, and beautiful islands. It is also an area of very big importance in world politics. Why? Because the Pacific Ocean is like a highway that connects America, Asia, and even further into the Indian Ocean. Ships carry oil, food, and goods through this region. Airplanes fly across this region. So, control of the Pacific means control of trade and travel. That is why many countries, including the United States, China, and Australia, pay very close attention to what happens here.
Exactly, Adam. When we think about the Pacific, we often imagine small islands with small populations. But these islands are sitting in very strategic positions. If you place military bases there, you can watch the sea. If you place radar there, you can see airplanes passing. If you build ports, you can refuel ships. That is why both China and the United States are trying to get closer to these islands. And Australia, because of geography, is also deeply involved. Australia sees itself as a regional leader. It feels a responsibility to help the smaller island nations, and also to make sure no one else, especially a big power like China, gains too much influence.
Let us take an example. In recent years, China has made strong connections with the Solomon Islands. They signed security agreements that could allow Chinese police or even military to be active there. For Australia, this was a shock. The Solomon Islands are not far from Australia. So, imagine waking up and hearing that another great power has made a security deal with your neighbor. Of course, it makes you nervous. Australia worries that one day, China could even build a base there. This would mean Chinese ships and planes close to Australia's coast. That is not just politics. It feels like a direct security threat.
And listeners, let us also think about history. During World War II, the Pacific Islands were very important battlegrounds. Many of you may have heard about the battles in places like Guadalcanal, Midway, or Papua New Guinea. Control of those islands gave military advantage. That lesson is not forgotten. The United States remembers it. Australia remembers it. And now China is acting with the same awareness. They know that if you want to project power in the Asia-Pacific, you need to have friends and partners in the islands.
Yes, Julia. And this creates a lot of pressure for Australia. On one hand, Australia wants to respect the independence of the island nations. These countries are small, but they have their own governments, their own voices, and their own interests. They do not want to be forced into a choice between China, the US, or Australia. Many of them want to work with whoever can bring them the most benefits, like infrastructure, healthcare, or climate change help. And honestly, China often comes with big promises, building roads, hospitals, or providing easy loans. That can be very attractive. But Australia and the United States worry that behind those economic offers, there could also be military ambitions.
That is where alliances come in. Australia is part of several security partnerships, like the Quad with the US, India, and Japan, and also the AUKUS agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom. These agreements are not only about sharing submarines or technology, they are also about showing presence in the Pacific. The idea is, if China is growing its presence, then other countries must also stay active, so the balance remains. For Australia, this means more military exercises, more visits to Pacific nations, and more promises of help to their neighbours.
But let us make it simple for our English learners. Think of it like a neighborhood. If a new person moves in and starts giving gifts to your closest neighbors, you may feel worried. Maybe that person just wants to be friendly. Or maybe that person wants to build strong influence, so later they can control the neighborhood. Australia feels like that. China is giving aid, building projects, and signing agreements in the Pacific. Australia is watching carefully because it wonders, is this just friendship? Or is it the beginning of something bigger?
That is such a clear way to explain it, Adam. And for our listeners, here is why this matters. Security in the Pacific is directly linked to Australia's survival as a safe and independent country. If China builds influence too close, Australia feels squeezed. If the United States reduces its presence, Australia feels alone. This is the double pressure that makes Australia's position very delicate. It is not only about trade or politics anymore, it is about national safety. That is why Australian leaders speak so much about the Pacific and spend resources there.
We should also mention the human side. Many Pacific islands face serious problems, especially climate change. Rising sea levels threaten their land and homes. For these nations, the biggest security threat is not China or the United States, but the ocean itself. So, when they hear offers of help, whether from China, the US, or Australia, they think first about survival. They need money and technology to fight climate change. That is why China can sometimes win influence. It offers fast and visible solutions. Australia, however, is now trying to improve its support and show that it understands these priorities.
So, dear listeners, when you think about Australia's security concerns in the Pacific, Remember that it is not just about soldiers and ships. It is also about competition of ideas, competition of promises, and competition of trust. Australia wants to remain the closest partner to the Pacific Islands, but China is also working very hard to gain trust. And the United States is always in the background, watching carefully and encouraging Australia to take leadership.
To conclude this section, Australia is in a race not of speed, but of influence. Every agreement, every aid project, every military visit counts. Because in the Pacific, small nations hold big importance. If they lean towards China, Australia feels less safe. If they lean towards Australia and the US, the balance stays in their favor. This is the reason Australia feels so much pressure when it looks at the Pacific. Let us now turn to a very big development in Australia's security story. This is the AUKUS agreement. Some of you may have heard this word before, but maybe you are not sure what it really means. So, let me explain. AUKUS is not a single country. It is an agreement between three countries: Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. If you look at the first letters of their names, A for Australia, UK for United Kingdom, and US for the United States, you get AUKUS. That is how the name was created. AUKUS is what we call a pact. The word pact means an agreement between two or more parties, usually about something very serious like defense or cooperation.
That is right, Adam. And here, I want to pause for a short teaching moment. For our English learners, 3 words are very important in this discussion. The first word is alliance. An alliance means a friendly partnership between countries, often for military or security reasons. The second word is treaty. A treaty is a formal, official agreement signed by countries, usually written down and approved by governments. The third word is pact, which we already mentioned. A pact is like a treaty, but sometimes it can be less formal or focused on a special issue. So, when you hear alliance, treaty, or pact, you know they all mean some kind of agreement, but with small differences.
Thank you, Julia. That is very helpful. Now, what makes AUKUS special? The most famous part of AUKUS is about submarines. Submarines, as you know, are ships that travel under the water. They can be used for defense, for intelligence, and even for carrying weapons. Australia already has submarines, but they are diesel-powered. That means they run on regular fuel and they must come to the surface more often. But under AUKUS, the United States and the United Kingdom will help Australia build and use nuclear-powered submarines. This does not mean they will carry nuclear weapons, but it does mean they will have nuclear engines. These submarines are faster, quieter, and can stay underwater much longer than diesel ones.
And listeners, this is a very big step for Australia. No other country, except the United Kingdom, has ever been given such technology from the United States. It shows a very deep level of trust. It means that the United States and the United Kingdom see Australia as one of their closest military partners. But of course, this decision also created strong reactions. China was very angry. Why? Because from China's point of view, nuclear submarines near their waters are a serious threat. Submarines are difficult to detect, and if Australia gets them, it means the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific is changing.
Exactly, Julia. And let us make it clear for our learners. Balance of power is another useful term. It means the way power is spread between countries. If one side becomes much stronger, the balance is broken, and other countries feel unsafe. China sees AUKUS as a way for the United States to strengthen its influence in Asia and to push back against China's rise. For Australia, however, the story looks different. Australia says, "We are not trying to threaten anyone. We are simply making sure we can defend ourselves in the future." In their eyes, nuclear submarines are a way to prepare for a more dangerous world.
And beyond submarines, AUKUS also covers technology sharing. This includes areas like artificial intelligence, cyber defense, quantum computing, and undersea systems. These are all very modern parts of military power. So AUKUS is not just about machines under the water. It is about preparing for the wars of the future, which may involve computers, satellites, and digital tools. This shows that AUKUS is a long-term partnership, not just a one-time deal.
But Julia, let us not forget, AUKUS is also a sign of trust, but also a sign of division. For China, it is a message that Australia has chosen sides. Before, Australia tried to balance between the US and China, friendly trade with China, but military ties with the US. Now, with AUKUS, it looks clearer that Australia is leaning more towards the US side. That is why Chinese leaders have said that AUKUS is dangerous, that it creates an arms race in the region. Arms race means when two or more countries try to build more and more weapons to be stronger than each other.
And let us bring in a learning point here. For English learners, notice the phrase military modernization. This means updating a country's military with new weapons, new technology, and new strategies. Every country modernizes its military from time to time. For Australia, AUKUS is a huge part of that modernization. Instead of staying with old technology, it is jumping forward into the future with the help of powerful friends.
That is well said. And for our listeners, we must also see how this feels inside Australia. Some Australians support AUKUS strongly. They believe it will protect the country and create jobs, because submarines and technology will be built partly in Australia. But others worry. They say nuclear submarines are very expensive. The cost could be hundreds of billions of dollars over decades. That is money that might not be spent on schools, hospitals, or climate change projects. So, even inside Australia, the AUKUS Pact creates debates.
And Adam, another important point. Many countries in the Pacific also reacted. Some Pacific nations are worried about nuclear technology. Even if it is only nuclear engines, the word nuclear makes people nervous, especially in regions that have suffered from nuclear testing in the past. These nations want peace and stability, not more military build-up. So Australia has to explain carefully that this is about defense, not aggression.
To wrap this section, dear listeners, AUKUS is more than a headline. It is a symbol. It shows that Australia is locking itself into a future with the United States and the United Kingdom. It shows that Australia wants to modernize its military and be ready for challenges. But it also shows the deep rivalry with China, because every submarine, every agreement, and every announcement makes China feel that Australia is no longer neutral. For English learners, remember the key vocabulary: alliance, treaty, pact, arms race, balance of power, and military modernization. These are the words that will help you understand the language of international relations and security. Now we arrive at another critical part of our story: the economic risks that Australia faces when it confronts China. To understand this, we need to remember something important. China is Australia's largest trading partner. That means China buys more Australian goods than any other country. We talked earlier about iron ore, coal, agriculture, education, and tourism. All of these bring huge amounts of money into Australia. But this economic relationship is also fragile, because China has shown that it can use trade as a political tool whenever it is unhappy with Australia's decisions.
Yes, Adam. And this is where things become complicated. Imagine for a moment that you are a farmer in Australia. You grow barley or you make wine, and suddenly you hear on the news that China has put a tariff on your product. A tariff is a kind of tax that makes your goods more expensive when they enter another country. If China raises tariffs on Australian barley or wine, then Chinese buyers will pay much more, and they may decide to buy from other countries instead. This is not just about numbers, It is about real people whose jobs and families depend on selling to China.
That is an excellent example, Julia. In fact, this already happened. When political tensions rose between Australia and China in recent years, Beijing responded with tariffs and restrictions on a wide range of products. They included barley, wine, beef, seafood, coal, and even timber. Some of these industries suddenly lost billions of dollars in exports. Farmers who had built their whole business model around Chinese customers had to look for new markets, and for many of them, that was not easy. Trade relationships take years to build, but they can collapse overnight when politics gets in the way.
And the impact goes beyond farmers. Let us talk about education. Before the pandemic, Australia was one of the most popular destinations for Chinese students. Tens of thousands of young people from China came to study at Australian universities. They paid tuition fees, they rented apartments, they ate in local restaurants, and they contributed to the economy in many ways. For some universities, Chinese students made up almost half of their international student population. But when tensions rose, there were warnings from Beijing telling students to think twice about studying in Australia. That kind of political signal can hurt universities deeply.
You are right, Julia. And the same goes for tourism. Chinese tourists once filled Australian cities, beaches, and shops. Their spending created jobs in hotels, restaurants, and travel companies. But when political relations became cold, the flow of Chinese visitors slowed. So the lesson is very clear. When you are so dependent on one country, you are always vulnerable. If that country becomes angry with you, it can reduce trade, restrict tourism, and influence where students choose to go. For Australia, this is a constant risk of confronting China.
But listeners, there is another side to this story. Some Australians argue that depending so much on one market is dangerous, even if the relationship is good. They say Australia should diversify. The word diversify means to spread out, to not put all your eggs in one basket. In trade, diversification means finding many different customers in many different countries, so that no single partner has too much control over your economy. For example, Australia has worked to increase trade with India, Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asian countries. The European Union is also a possible partner.
That is true, Julia, and diversification is not only about selling goods, it is also about buying from other countries. For example, if Australia relies on China for certain products, like manufactured goods or electronics, then a sudden restriction can cause shortages. That is why Australian companies are now trying to import more from other places, like Vietnam or Indonesia. It is not easy, because China is such a big and efficient producer. But slowly, step by step, diversification is happening. This reduces the risk that one political disagreement could damage the whole economy.
Still, the challenge remains. Even if you diversify, you cannot completely replace China. Its market is simply too large. Its demand for iron ore and coal is so high that Australia cannot find another single country to buy the same amount. That is why, even during tensions, some trade like iron ore continues strongly. China needs Australian resources, and Australia needs Chinese customers. It is like a marriage where both partners sometimes fight, but still depend on each other for survival. The question is, how long can such a relationship last when trust is so weak?
And this, dear listeners, brings us to the heart of Australia's economic dilemma. If Australia stands firmly with the United States and criticizes China, it risks losing billions of dollars in trade. Farmers, companies, students, and workers all feel the pain. But if Australia stays silent to protect trade, it may lose credibility with its allies and fail to protect its security interests. This is the economic risk of confronting China. Every move has a cost, and sometimes the cost is paid not by politicians, but by ordinary people working in fields, factories, and classrooms.
And that is why Australian leaders talk so often about resilience. Resilience means the ability to survive shocks and bounce back stronger. Australia knows that China can punish it economically. So it tries to build resilience by saving money, by diversifying trade, and by strengthening ties with partners. But the truth is, building resilience takes time. For now, many industries are still exposed to China's decisions, and that makes every confrontation a very dangerous gamble.
To summarize, listeners, the economic risks of confronting China are very real. They include tariffs on goods, restrictions on tourism, warnings for students, and sudden bans on imports. These punishments hurt farmers, businesses, and workers. At the same time, Australia is trying to diversify and build resilience. But this is a long journey. So every step in foreign policy becomes a calculation. How much can we say or do without losing too much economically? This constant balancing act is what makes Australia's position so difficult. Now we move to an important part of our story: what ordinary Australians think about all of this. Governments make policies, leaders give speeches, and experts write reports. But in the end, it is citizens who live with the consequences. Public opinion in Australia is deeply divided when it comes to the United States and China. Some Australians believe the country should build stronger ties with the United States because they see America as a traditional ally and protector. Others argue that Australia should not take sides too strongly, but instead try to balance between both the US and China to keep peace and protect economic interests.
Yes, Adam, and this division can be seen in everyday conversations, in the media, and in political debates. Newspapers and television channels often show different views depending on their audience. Some media outlets emphasize the importance of the US alliance and warn about the dangers of China's rise. Others focus more on the economic benefits of China and suggest that being too close to the United States could bring unnecessary conflict. For ordinary Australians, it can be confusing. They hear many voices, and each one tells a different story about what is safe, what is smart, and what is right for the future.
Let us look first at the economic concerns. Many Australian citizens worry about jobs, businesses, and stability. They know that China buys a huge amount of Australian products, from iron ore and coal to wine and seafood. If relations become worse, ordinary workers in farms, mines, and factories may lose income. This is why some people say, we cannot afford to anger China too much, because our economy depends on them. For them, the fear is not about soldiers or submarines. Their fear is about losing customers, losing exports, and losing opportunities for their children in a world where China plays such a big role.
On the other hand, many Australians also feel deep security fears. They look at China's growing power in the region and ask, what if one day China becomes too dominant? What if they build bases in the Pacific or challenge our freedom at sea? For these citizens, the economy is important, but safety comes first. They believe that only the United States can offer protection because Australia is too small to stand alone. These people usually support the AUKUS agreement and welcome stronger defense ties with Washington. Their thinking is simple: better to sacrifice some trade today than to risk national survival tomorrow.
And this is what makes public opinion so divided. You have one group that says, think of the economy, protect jobs, and keep friendly relations with China. You have another group that says, think of security, protect our independence, and trust the US alliance. Both sides have logical reasons, and both are speaking from real experiences. The farmer in South Australia, who lost wine exports to Chinese tariffs, will naturally see China as a critical partner. The defense worker in Canberra, who studies China's military growth, will naturally see the US alliance as essential. Public opinion is shaped by where you live, what job you do, and what you fear most.
That is a very clear picture, Adam. And for our listeners, here is a simple way to understand it. Australians are caught between two kinds of fear. One is the fear of losing money, jobs, and trade if relations with China go badly. The other is the fear of losing safety, independence, and freedom if China becomes too powerful. Both fears are real, and both influence how people vote and how they see the world. Politicians must listen to these voices and try to find a balance, but it is not easy when the public itself is divided almost down the middle.
Another layer of this debate is generational difference. Some younger Australians are more open to China because they study with Chinese students at universities, travel to Asia, and work in international businesses. They see China as part of their future. Older Australians, who grew up during the Cold War and saw the United States as the main protector, are often more skeptical of China and more supportive of U.S. ties. So, age also plays a role in shaping opinion. Media adds even more influence, with some platforms focusing heavily on economic stories and others on security challenges.
And let us not forget the political side. Different political parties in Australia also reflect these divisions. Some leaders argue strongly for standing firm against China, even if it means economic loss. They say principles of democracy and security should come first. Others argue for a softer, more pragmatic approach, suggesting that constant confrontation with China only harms ordinary Australians. This political debate shows that public opinion matters because leaders know they must win votes, and votes come from citizens who are affected by both trade and security policies.
For our English learners, notice how words like divided, opinion, debate, and balance are used in this context. Divided means people are not in agreement. Opinion means personal belief or view. Debate is when people discuss different sides of an issue. And balance means trying to give fair weight to two sides without falling too much to one. These words are very useful when you want to talk about politics and society in English. They help you describe the complexity of situations like this one in Australia.
That is a very good teaching point, Adam. And listeners, remember that public opinion does not stay the same forever. It changes with events. If there is a trade crisis, more people may say, "We need China." If there is a military incident, more people may say, "We need the US." So, public opinion is like water. It flows, it moves, and it reacts to what happens around it. This makes the job of leaders very difficult, because they must make long-term decisions in a world where public opinion can change very quickly.
In conclusion, dear listeners, Australians are divided in their views about China and the United States. Some focus on the economy, jobs, and stability, while others focus on security, independence, and alliances. Media, politics, age, and personal experience all shape these views. For our English learners, understanding this division helps you see why Australia's policies often look like a balancing act. It is not just leaders making choices, it is also citizens pushing them in different directions, each with their own hopes and fears. We have now arrived at a very important part of today's discussion. Until now, we have explored Australia's geography, its economy, its security, and the complex relations it has with both the United States and China. But what about the future? What could actually happen in the next decade? Will Australia choose one side completely, or will it continue to walk on the thin line between two giants? These are the questions many analysts, journalists, and politicians are asking. And for us, as English learners and global citizens, it is very useful to think about these scenarios because they help us understand not only politics, but also how countries make difficult decisions.
Exactly, Adam. When we look at Australia's position, there are three big possibilities for its future path. First, Australia could lean fully towards the United States and strengthen that alliance even more. Second, it might try to reconcile and smooth relations with China, especially for economic reasons. And third, it could continue this balancing act, trying to benefit from both sides without committing too much to one. Each of these scenarios has risks and benefits, and today we will explore them in detail for our listeners.
Let's start with the first scenario. Imagine Australia leaning fully towards the United States. This would mean tighter military cooperation, stronger participation in alliances like AUKUS, and perhaps even hosting more American troops and military bases. Economically, it would also mean reducing dependence on China and turning more towards markets in the US, Europe, Japan, and India. Some Australians think this is the safest path because it secures protection under America's power. They argue that in a world where China is becoming stronger, being firmly tied to Washington is the best insurance for national security.
But there are also challenges here. If Australia goes too far in supporting the United States, it could damage its economic relationship with China even more. China is still its biggest buyer of resources, education services, and agricultural goods. So if Australia openly says, "We are fully on America's side," then Beijing might respond with stronger tariffs, restrictions, or even political isolation. This would mean pain for farmers, universities, tourism, and exporters. So while this option offers security, it carries high economic costs. And many Australians worry about losing jobs, markets, and growth if this path becomes reality.
Now, let's think about the second scenario. What if Australia tries to reconcile with China? This would mean reducing tensions, lowering the strong political language, and focusing on trade, education, and investment. Some politicians and business leaders in Australia support this idea. They say that without China, the economy will struggle and that jobs depend on this partnership. If Australia restores warm ties with Beijing, the flow of students, tourists, and trade could return to normal. This would help many ordinary citizens.
That sounds like an attractive choice, but again, it comes with risks. If Australia moves closer to China and away from the US, then Washington might see that as betrayal. The United States could reduce military support or see Australia as unreliable. And remember, Australia depends on the US for security in the region. Without that, it would be difficult to balance China's growing presence in the Pacific. So, going too far towards Beijing might solve economic problems, but create very serious security fears.
That brings us to the third scenario, which is continuing the balancing act. This means that Australia will keep its military alliance with the US while at the same time maintaining strong trade with China. In fact, this is what it has been doing for the past 20 years. Many people think this is the most realistic option. It allows Australia to enjoy American protection while still benefiting from Chinese markets. But it is not easy. Balancing is like walking on a tightrope. If you lean too much to one side, you fall. And in global politics, sudden events can push you off balance very quickly.
Exactly. For example, if there is a crisis in Taiwan or the South China Sea, the United States might ask Australia to take a clear side. In that situation, balancing would no longer be possible. On the other hand, if China increases tariffs again, Australian businesses may demand stronger support from the government. These pressures make balancing very difficult in the long term. Still, it might remain the strategy because it gives flexibility and avoids extreme consequences.
So, listeners, when we think about the future of Australia, we can see three possible roads: full alignment with the United States, reconciliation with China, or continued balancing between both. None of them are perfect, and each one brings its own set of challenges. The real question is, how long can Australia keep this balance before it is forced to choose?
And that is the heart of today's topic. This is why Australia's case is so interesting and so important for us to study. It is not just about one country, but about how middle powers manage themselves in a world dominated by giants. For English learners, thinking about these scenarios also gives us the chance to practice vocabulary like alignment, reconciliation, tariffs, and balancing act. These are very useful words, not only in politics but also in daily conversation about choices and strategies.
We would love to hear from you, dear listeners. Which path do you think Australia should take? Should it lean towards the United States, reconcile with China, or keep balancing both? Please share your thoughts in the comments section and tell us what you think.
Yes, And also let us know where you are listening from. We love seeing comments from people all over the world. It makes this learning community even stronger.
Dear listeners, as we come to the final part of our podcast, it is important to reflect on what we have discussed today. Australia is in a very unique and challenging position between two global powers, the United States and China. On one side, it has a strong alliance with the United States, which provides security and military cooperation. On the other side, Australia has significant dependence on China for trade, education, and tourism, which creates a real dilemma for policymakers.
Yes, Adam. And for our English learners, it is useful to focus on key vocabulary. The word alliance means a partnership or agreement between countries, usually for protection or shared goals. Dependence describes a situation where one country relies heavily on another for resources or economic support. A dilemma is a situation where making a decision is very difficult because all options involve risks. Finally, strategy refers to a carefully planned approach to achieve goals in politics, security, or business.
Australia's strategy has been to carefully balance these competing priorities. It maintains close military ties with the United States while still trading extensively with China. This approach allows Australia to benefit from economic growth while ensuring national security. However, balancing both sides is extremely challenging because tensions can rise quickly, and each decision carries economic, political, and security consequences. Even a single diplomatic statement can affect trade or alliances.
And for the citizens of Australia, this balancing act creates daily questions and concerns. Some people prioritise economic stability and fear losing markets in China, which supports farmers, exporters, and universities. Others prioritise national security and worry that without strong US ties, Australia could be vulnerable in a region where China is increasing its influence. Public opinion is therefore deeply divided, showing how individual perspectives shape national debates.
Listeners, this situation teaches a broader lesson about international relations. Countries must make careful calculations when dealing with powerful neighbors. They must develop a strategy that protects security, supports the economy, and considers public opinion at home. Australia's example shows that even a stable and democratic country must navigate very complex choices, especially when it faces large global powers with competing interests.
Now, for our learners, it is useful to think beyond vocabulary. Consider this. How would your own country respond if it were between two powerful nations with different demands? Would it prioritize trade, security, or attempt a careful balance? Reflecting on such questions helps you understand not only politics, but also decision-making processes, negotiation skills, and the pressures that governments face in the real world.
To summarize, Australia is facing a combination of economic and security pressures that are difficult to resolve. Its alliance with the United States strengthens defense, while its dependence on China maintains economic growth. The nation faces a constant dilemma, and its strategy of balancing both sides requires careful planning, foresight, and resilience. For students of English, understanding this story helps you use vocabulary and context and improve comprehension of global issues.
And finally, dear listeners, we encourage you to reflect on today's discussion. Think about the choices Australia must make and consider what lessons can be applied to other countries or even personal decisions. International relations is not only about countries and leaders. It is about the impact on people, economies, and societies. By studying these situations, you can better understand global events and practice English in a meaningful context.
Thank you for staying with us through this detailed exploration. Remember to review the vocabulary, alliance, dependence, dilemma, and strategy. These words are useful not only in politics, but in everyday English conversations about planning, challenges, and relationships. Australia's position reminds us how language and learning can help us analyze complex issues clearly.
That's right, Adam. And dear learners, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us how you think your country would act in a similar situation. Reflect on the lessons of balance, strategy, and careful planning. This reflection strengthens both your understanding of international relations and your English skills. Thank you for joining us at the English Globe, and we look forward to exploring more global topics with you in the future.